You just lost yourself a customer.
So I was having a conversation with someone, and they told me we were talking about Zack Snyder's take on the DCEU, and this person told me that Zack Snyder has a very nihilistic viewpoint of the world, and it comes across in his DCEU films. And at first, I was like, "What are you talking about? That's not true. Like, did he really say this?" And this person was telling me, "Yes." And I went down this rabbit hole trying to do, all the research that I can and trying to find clips or articles saying that Zack Snyder's viewpoint is very nihilistic. Now, I couldn't find any, so take that for what you will. So I went down this rabbit hole and I found this article from Tyler Hummel, and it's basically the main premise is Zack Snyder's Superman decoding the Man of Steel's nihilist godhood. And it's a very interesting article, and it really is quite the insight into the worldview and how Zack Snyder's worldview points, acts as an avatar for these DCU characters and the story that he's telling. Now, I don't agree entirely with this article. Some points I agree with, some I don't. But I thought it was a very insightful observation into Zack Snyder's mind and how he sees the world and how he sees these characters if they were placed in the real world. And I think that's why so many people had so many issues and problems with Zack Snyder's DCEU. So I thought it was very, very fascinating. So let's dive in. Zack Snyder is a fascinating filmmaker. He's one of the most visually engaging, energetic, and splendid filmmakers alive today. He's also, by all accounts, a decent guy behind the scenes who seems to have a great relationships, intentions, and ambitions as a filmmaker. He's also an incredibly flaccid storyteller, which that's the part where I really don't agree with. When he's not working off of the framework of better storytellers, 300, Watchmen, he's making hollow films with huge ideas and no means to fully express them. Dawn of the Dead, Sucker Punch. Now, I disagree with Dawn of the Dead. I really like that film and I love the concept and ideas. Sucker Punch, I have to agree. I thought Sucker Punch was horrifically horrendous. I thought it was a really bad film. Really bad film. Again, I understand what Zack Snyder was going for. His heart was in the right place, but just like Tyler said, I think the ideas and the execution was way off base. This is clearly the case for his two completed DC Comics adaptations. Man of Steel and Batman v Superman are two of the most ambitious and enthralling pieces of visual storytelling in the superhero genre to date. They are fluid, massive, and eye-popping films, but the most basic level of introspection reveals a casual lack of confidence. If you remove the disturbing visuals, bleak tone, and high body counts, both of these films are dreary and joyless films that disabuse two of the most popular children's characters to tell a mature story about despair, trauma, and the terror of godhood. With the release of the infamous Snyder Cut of Justice League, I wanted to go back and watch the two films with fresh eyes. I don't think I'd fully sat through either film since 2016 when the latter was released. I was curious how they'd stack up upon reflection. In doing so, I came to two strange conclusions about the films. This should be interesting. First being that they're still not great, unsurprising. Secondly, there's a lot going on in those films that's worth discussing. These films seem to have developed the rabid fan base they have because they are essentially perfect DC Comics films. In a lot of ways, I actually think Snyder is the perfect fit for the kind of stories that DC Comics has long wanted to tell with their characters. Snyder and DC both share the same pretentious, pseudo-mythic storytelling and the belief that comic books are the next big medium for literally storytelling. Which, again, I agree. I think DC Comics are like really high art for the most part with some stories. Alan Moore's Watchmen and Swamp Thing and other creators. And I think Zack Snyder was trying to emulate that on the big screen. Again, whether he succeeded or not, I think he did for the most part. But, as we've seen, a lot of people disagree with my opinion on that. You can see it in the way that DC casts its cast of heroes. DC likes to treat its characters like a pantheon of gods, which they are. This is event in all of the properties, from the new gods to injustice gods among us. Even non-powered characters like Batman and Green Arrow are treated like godlings and forces of nature, especially Batman. Like Green Arrow is just a dude. His only power is communism and archery. Why is he fighting literal gods? Modern DC writers treat their heroes and villains with the power and grandeur that Norse, Greek, and Roman writers treated their gods with. They've treated like forces of nature whose whims can shake the foundations of the earth. They are above us, beyond us, and we have no power to stop them. We live and die by their mercy and grace. There's a grandiose to this DC that's part of the core of their brand appeal. Marvel treats its heroes like celebrities and everyday people. They live in normal cities, pay rent, and struggle with relationship issues. When people meet Thor, the Norse god of thunder, on the street, they ask him for an autograph, whereas DC characters are looked at with adoration. It's clear this appeals to comic readers because fans of the medium have struggled with the fact that their favorite medium is quintessential children's literature, quote unquote, since its foundation, and wants to be able to hand out stories that reflect the emotional importance these stories have for them. Being able to treat Superman and Wonder Woman like secular demigods walking around us gives us the stories an air of weight and importance to them, which I think for the most part they do. Again, depending on the writer. That's all well and good in a Grant Morrison, Ancient Aliens kind of way, but the thing DC Comics and Warner Bros. Lack is a sense of moral content behind these godlings. I agree with that, especially these Warner Bros. Executives who have no clue about any of these characters whatsoever, even though they own the IP, which is baffling to me. These characters have gotten progressively less moral and more violent as time has gone on. I agree with Watchmen, BVS. I mean, BVS, like Batman's literally fucking branding fools and killing them. So he has a point there. The comics have gotten more dark and more mature, and yet that's mostly manifested in superficial ways like cheap gore, gratuitous death and destruction, and hardcore nudity. There's a reason why an unironically good character like Superman gets constantly rewritten as a villain, frequently in modern retellings. Writers simply don't know how to conceive, how to write power and human decency in the same body and mind. I agree with that 1000%. For a character that's supposed to be the secular rendition of a modern Christ figure, Superman doesn't have any sort of wisdom or guidance to be a benevolent demigod. He works much better as a character. In fact, when the writers focus more on Clark Kent and play up his common decency as sincerity and boyish innocence. That's why the Chris Reeve Superman movies have always worked. No matter how cynical the world was, Superman was always a good man. He was just a man of uncommon kindness and decency in the world of the 1970s corporate America. Again, I agree 1000%. Consider them how Zack Snyder approaches the quintessential character of Superman. Thus far, he's had a 2-movie arc that was superficially wrapped up in the theatrical cut of Justice League. Disregarding the third part, what kind of story has Snyder been telling with the world's most popular and optimistic superhero? Well, I think we know the answer to that. Man of Steel had an amazing opening thematically. We are introduced to Krypton as a decadent, dying world. It's a tyrannical kingdom of selfish bureaucrats and eugenicists who have rebuilt society from the ground up to be entirely artificial. They've gone too far, and now the world is literally breaking apart. In a last-ditched effort to save the planet, Zod performs a fascist military coup to save what they can, and Jor-El attempts to send the last natural-born child of Krypton to a new world and start fresh and carry on the legacy of their world. Immediately, though, we are faced with a contradiction. Clark Kent is a godlike alien sent from the heavens to shape the destiny of the planet Earth. He isn't coming with a clear mission, though. He's not Prometheus or Lucifer defying the whims of a tyrannical father figure. He's not an angel or a Christ figure coming to deliver the word of God to a broken world. Earth is otherwise portrayed in the film as a beautiful and humanistic in Terrence Malick-style slow shots of rural American life. I guess you could say Jor-El is sending him to be the last refugee of his people, but he knows full well that he'll be regarded as a god among men, and that planet is deeply, deeply flawed. As he grows up, the young Kryptonian struggles with his sense of meaning. This version of Clark Kent has no affirmative ideology. He represents nothing. He is driven by nothing. All he does is the right thing, quote unquote. That's nice and all, but he's otherwise so existentially burdened that I don't know why people think he's so important. He's significant as an alien because his existence disrupts a number of our preconceptions about life, faith, and the universe. But he, in himself, is not special because the fact that he can really punch really hard. Oh my god, this dude is off the chain. Again, I can see where he's coming from. I don't really fully agree, but I see his points. So this version of Clark Kent more or less spends the first 30 years of his life as a wandering vagrant doing kind deeds and then disappearing like a sexy version of the 1970s Incredible Hulk. He doesn't really know what he wants, but eventually he finds out he's an alien from Krypton and that he has the power to change the world by setting an example for what they could be. Again, I really love that concept. But again, I think even though I love Man of Steel and I love the ideas, I don't think Zack Snyder fully knows how to communicate them in a way that's palatable for the general audience. Again, if we're doing fair criticisms, right? And I'm sure people will be like, I'm sure all the Snyder cultures like, what are you talking about? Man of Steel was perfect. It's like, okay, you people are just fucking brain dead and are a lost cause. I'm not exactly sure what a depressive 20-something is going to contribute to the world besides CrossFit advice, but whatever. So when Zod comes to Earth, we finally have his antithesis and a moral challenge for him to work against. Zod is everything Kal-El left behind on Krypton. He's a violent, genocidal sociopath who is honor-bound to a racist code that puts his own people above all other life in the universe. So why did he come to Earth? We learn at one point that Zod came because he followed the tracking signal that was activated by Clark activating the alien ship in the Arctic. Clark's desire to come to terms with his identity and powers creates the threat of the movie. That adds some interesting color context for Clark Kent's journey. Superman, functionally, makes the world more dangerous by his very presence. His desire to learn more about his identity and meaning accidentally imperils the Earth. It'll be a theme that continues to reappear throughout the two movies. Moving on though, Clark eventually destroys the Kryptonian ships and faces Zod alone on the battlefield as the last survivors of their species. As we find out in Zod's final soliloquy, he's a genetically engineered being. His entire motivation from the start of the film has been reprogrammed. He's psychotically loyal to Krypton and his people, and he'll stop at nothing to follow his programming. Zod thus represents the total adherence to the failure of Krypton. He represents the last vestige of his people's failure and their effect on the rest of the universe. Here we get Clark's first major moral decision. Clark rejects his home and world and people, destroys the baby-making spaceship and the terraforming device, and kills Zod in cold blood. Well, again, he was going to kill a family, to be fair. Krypton has been totally destroyed and left to be forgotten. Again, I have zero problem with Superman killing Zod because he was going to kill a family and Superman didn't want to. Now, could Zack Snyder and David Goyer shown a little bit more context, like in a flashback where we really see the moral code that Clark Kent has that he will never ever kill? I think that would have helped people who had a problem with Clark Kent killing Zod. But again, me personally, I had no problem with it whatsoever. Because, like, again, according to comics, Superman has killed before in the comics. He's killed Zod and more of his people with kryptonite. Now, there's a lot of talk since 2013 about the moral implications of Superman killing Zod, but I'm not terribly interested in the implications of them at the moment. Zack Snyder, David Goyer, and Christopher Nolan wanted to write their own character with this new rendition, and automatically excluding the possibility of a no-win scenario wasn't something they wanted to write. I can overlook the Superman doesn't kill, quote-unquote, thing for the sake of a standalone story. The only real problem with it is that the story doesn't comment upon it. He's not disturbed by killing his last Kryptonian brother for more than a few minutes. He doesn't regret it enough to dedicate his life to protecting life at all costs, which would have made a good setup for his sacrifice at the end of the next movie. I do agree with that. I think like we see the scream when he kills Zod, and then we see Lois Lane and he hugs Lois Lane. But literally, the next scene is him talking shit to General Swanwick and says, "Hey, I'm here to help. don't follow me, don't look into me, and leave me the fuck alone. That's literally the next scene. And for BVS, again, this is why I didn't want a BVS sequel. No, let me rephrase that. This is why I didn't want a fucking Batman movie, because BVS is a Batman movie. I wanted a Man of Steel sequel where we see Clark Kent really agonizing over the fact that he had to kill not only Zod, not only like his people, but really go through the emotions, the emotional journey of Clark Kent dealing with that and dealing with the fact that thousands of people have died. Because we really, in BVS, the sequel, quote unquote, we really don't see any of that. We don't see Clark Kent really mourning over the fact like, oh my God, like thousands of people have died and it's basically my fault. We don't see any of that. Which really bothered me. And I think Henry Cavill would have done an amazing job of portraying Clark Kent in that light, of really seeing him through his journey, of him being just broken down, but not in a way that's fucking somber and shit, but in a way that's relatable and doesn't make the audience feel like, oh my God, like this movie is just really depressing me. I think Henry Cavill would have done an amazing job portraying that guilt and that weight. But, it is what it is. You can't do anything about it now. The most important thing about Clark's decision to understand is that he's made an affirmative decision to be a human rather than a Kryptonian. He has the powers of a godling, but he refuses to abandon his surrogate homeworld to protect his genetic line. Unfortunately, this moment is confused by a lack of what Clark believes his true purpose is as Superman. Superman has definitely staked his moral claim in some regard. He's not a Kryptonian. What is he, though? Good question. Again, this Superman lacks moral content. He's entirely dedicated to rejecting everyone around him besides Lois, and he never has a moment where people ask him why he does. There's no great speech in front of all of humanity where this alien refugee asks the world to come together in peace or to be excellent to one another. I agree with that. Prime example, the courthouse scene where he's literally just standing there and then the place explodes. That could have been the perfect scene for Chris Terrio to write just this unifying, heroic speech and really get into the mindset of Clark Kent. It's like, I'm here to help people. I don't mean any harm. But again, Henry Cavill, who would have delivered that speech in such an eloquent, elegant, heroic way, you just completely just asked that for a fucking explosion. It's like, come on, what is this? Again, this is why it pisses me off. Like, the more I think about it, the more I understand Henry Cavill's frustration with the character and the way he's being directed. He simply is hope, despite the fact that he seems to make things worse by his presence. Both movies allude to the idea that Superman is a symbol of hope. His S symbol famously symbolizes hope on Krypton, but it's never explained how or why. Why does an alien being arriving on Earth give hope to the hopeless? I agree. It's never fully explored or explained. What's that supposed to mean? What does hope to the hopeless mean? I agree. I agree. I agree. I can't get mad at this. Again, if you're being fair, right? If you're going to give constructive, fair criticisms, I think he has a point. In the comics, Superman was always the representative of truth, justice, and the American way. In order for that to be true, he needs a challenge where those ideals are questioned and his adherence to them saves the day. Instead, we got a film about rejecting the past at all costs that teaches us that our desires for good come with unintended costs and that other cultures are things to be rejected. I can't. Again, I agree. Superman doesn't even trust the army in this film. Well, there's a reason why. He just asks to be left alone and promises not to be the bad guy. When they don't listen to them, he destroys their drones and satellites until they do what they're told. I'm not sure Man of Steel realizes that it's not saying positive things about the Superman when he does this. It doesn't really have a strong, and this is from a critique from another reviewer. it doesn't really have a strong sense of what it's trying to accomplish, at least nowhere near its sense of what it doesn't want to be. It doesn't want to be the Richard Donner Superman. It doesn't want to be Superman Returns. It doesn't want to be the Superman of the DC animated universe or even the comics, which in and of itself is troubling because it means the filmmakers are starting from the premise that the material they're starting from is somehow broken or inadequate and in need of their repair. But that wouldn't be a deal breaker if they did have some kind of new revolutionary take on the material. Interesting point. The film is so deeply averse to falling into the cliches of other Superman stories that it doesn't build off of the foundation of the character in a meaningful way. If you want to write a morose, existentially bothered Superman story that explores the nature of power and godhood, go right ahead. You just need to fully commit to it. Which I feel like Zack Snyder, I feel like he does, but again, I think it all goes back to the story and the ideas and the concepts and the way it's executed. The story, the ideas are there and they're great and they're brilliant. But again, it all boils down to execution, and that's where a lot of people had a problem. It's not the ideas or the concepts or the way or the way the characterizations of Superman is being portrayed. The problem is the way you write it, the way you film it, the way you direct it, and the way it's executed on the big screen. That's the main problem that a lot of people have. Then, of course, we get to Batman v Superman. This film is either one of the most hated and controversial pop films in decades or a shining example of cinema at the height of his abilities. Its fans adore it beyond all reason, and its critics despise it beyond all reason. It rewrites the entire DC mythos to build radically new renditions of its most famous characters, and yet never fully digs into the crawl enough to justify its characters' actions. This is a movie so dark that Lex Luthor kidnaps Superman's mother and threatens to torture her and burn her alive as a witch if he doesn't commit cold-blooded murder and destroy the Batman. This was pretty much the moment that alienated me from the story when I saw it opening night. Well, it's no secret that the theatrical version of BVS, I thought it was hot garbage. It really fucking broke my heart. It really broke my heart because BVS was one of my most anticipated movies, probably like of all time, like Batman v Superman, and I saw it in theaters and I was like, this is garbage. This is trash. Thank God we had Civil War a couple months later. Let's not breeze by the point either Batman vs. Superman is dark. It's probably the most superficially dark and unsettling film to earn a PG-13 rating in the last decade. Where certainly the Batman, Matt Reeves' Batman, certainly pushes that PG-13 to the limit. Yet, it's not just doing it for shock value. BVS spent 3 years in production and set itself up as the be-all, end-all of mythical and thematically deep superhero films. It wanted to be the film that turned the genre of Superman and Iron Man into proper cinema and tell an equivalent story to something like The Godfather and Goodfellas did for mobster films. In execution, well, you either like this movie or you don't. Ignoring the quality arguments for a moment, the film takes themes established in Man of Steel and starts fully developing them. If the first film was merely distrustful of power and goodness, this film full-on deconstructs the notion of Christ-like power down to the bones and leaves nothing left. If there were ever an argument that DC heroes can tonally amoral gods, we see it in the opening scene of BVS where Bruce Wayne witnesses the cataclysm of the final scenes of the last movie as 9/11 style disaster, wherein hundreds of thousands of people suddenly die in the rubble of falling buildings. It's horrific and tragic. We are led to fear what's happening to these humans caught in the rubble in the same way a national tragedy, thank you, leaves us shocked. We just watch human bodies get chewed up apart by metal and fire and squander in the aftermath, while Superman and Zod fight over the fate of the world. If there's any moral to this scene, it's that humanity deserves to hate the gods. Fair point. As will become clear though, nobody in the film hates Superman more than Clark Kent himself. Clark Kent in this film is even more morose and self-loathing than ever. The life of being the world's savior is shown as burdensome and exhausting. He's endlessly criticized by the news media, and people show up in mobs to protest him as a false god and an abomination against God. I agree with that. As quickly becomes clear, though, it's not just Superman who doesn't like what he is. The movie itself hates Superman and distrusts the nature of what he is. The entire film's plot rests on the notion that Superman is dangerous and untrustworthy, and it's clear that that story agrees. We even see it in tiny details as Cinema Sangha writes. I don't know who that guy is. Maybe he's a YouTuber or a writer. But here's what he had to say about Superman in BVS. This Superman, quote unquote, is not a man of the people. He doesn't seem to ever grant interviews, for instance, and he is constantly aloof. While the movie gives Batman and Lex Luthor a very particular and well-argued point of view about this god among us, it offers no counterpoint for Superman. Superman himself doesn't even seem to be very invested in being a hero or saving people. He never has a scene where he puts forth any kind of philosophy, and every character in this movie gets a scene where they are allowed to pontificate on sophomore level philosophy. It's because Snyder doesn't believe in what Superman stands for. He doesn't believe the idea that he's just a guy trying to do the right thing by the world, and that he doesn't have to learn to do it or be convinced not to quit. That is just, that this is just how Superman is. It's as integral to him as his Kryptonian powers, because Snyder can't understand the aspect of Superman. He undermines it all the time. His Superman engages in a bare minimum amount of heroism. We see Batman taking care of more business than Superman. Wait, what? I'm sorry, like the way I'm reading it, like it's not really well written. Like I don't know if this guy has like broken English or something. So it's not me, trust me. His Superman engages in the bare minimum of amount of heroism. We see Batman taking care of more business than Superman, who mostly helps the people closest to him. We also see Bruce Wayne save more people during the Battle of Metropolis than Superman did in Man of Steel. His Superman is an asshole, a pompous and condescending jerk who makes threats. I wouldn't go that far. No, I disagree with that. Come on now. Again, Superman was fighting someone on the same power levels as him. So would I have liked to have seen, maybe a scene where Henry Cavill's like, stop, please, there's people around. Sure, but I don't think that's a fair criticism towards, Zack Snyder's Superman. The movie doesn't just stop there. It does everything it can to casually mutilate the Superman mythos. Classic characters like Jimmy Olsen show up for individual scenes just to be assassinated. That was weird. Grant you, that was weird. Superman's own father gives a speech about how doing the right thing always ends up backfiring and creating unintended consequences. Oh, yeah, okay, that's fair. That's fair. The film doesn't just think that the characters of Superman is corny. It actively exists to break him down. His mythos, beliefs, and identity are all laid on the chopping block and deconstructed until all that is left is the cold, depressive godling with no purpose for his powers. The portrayal more easily matches the portrayal of Clark we see in the comic books like Lex Luthor, Man of Steel, where Superman is portrayed like a monstrous anti-human abomination who talks down to mere mortals. I believe that's the Lex Luthor Lee Bermejo book, which, by the way, was excellent. I highly recommend that book. It's great. Any trace of hope in the film is dead from the word go, and Clark Kent just isn't capable to being a Christ-like figure for it. He's too burdened by the weight of his powers and duty. By the end, Clark Kent's sacrifice is almost entirely colored by his self-loathing. Just as he flies off to kill the Batman, he looks to Lois Lane and says, "Nobody stays good in this world," quote unquote. He seemingly lost hope that his ideals can survive in a world determined to break you. I agree with that. In the end, he kills the monstrous Doomsday and suffers a moral injury in slaying the being that Lex Luthor describes as the devil. The story standing for God dies with him. Superman only finds absolution and humanity in his death. He's only accepted by the world the moment the world realizes that it doesn't have him anymore. Man of Steel implicitly suggested that the world was put in moral danger by Superman's presence, and Batman v Superman takes the idea farther by foreshadowing that Superman's existence will put the world in danger. When the time-traveling Flash shows up early in the film to warn Bruce Wayne, he tells him that he's right to worry about Superman and that he needs to do something to stop him. If it weren't for the fact that Superman is implicitly going to come back to life in the third movie to fight the new gods, the movie would altogether be suggesting that the world is better off without Superman. Maybe Justice League originally was supposed to resolve this tension by rebuking this Superman's own hatred of himself by teaching him what he could be, but I really doubt Zack Snyder has that kind of emotional depth within him. I don't think he knows how to reach in a character's depths of despair and to pull them out. Lest we forget that the last time he tried, he gave us that Martha moment. Again, I don't mind the Martha moment. I thought it made sense, but again, what do I always say? It always comes down to execution. The concept, the idea was great, but the execution, again, depending on who you are, some of it worked for you, some of it didn't work for you. I thought it worked. The color Superman's death as though he were reliving the earth by his burden. By God killing himself alongside the devil, the world is implicitly left safer. This isn't tragic hubris or nobility. This is nihilism. This is a character collapsing under the weight of his own depression, and the world being better off for it. Interesting. I never really thought about it that way, but that certainly is a interesting observation. Again, it all depends on whether you agree with that or not. Superman's life has to actually mean something for his death to matter. I agree with that. When he lacks the moral character to stand for himself and defend his right to exist, the world is right to declare him as a monster. Interesting. Let's see. He goes on and on. I think I want to get to a point where he says this, and it really just hammers it home. Zack Snyder is ambitious, but the kind of story he's trying to tell doesn't work if we don't dramatize the answer to the most basic question of all for Superman as a character. What does it mean to be a good person? Woo! Man, what an interesting article. I suggest you guys check it out for yourself if you want to, give fair, constructive criticisms. Again, this article was well written for the most part. I agree with some of the points. I disagree with some of the points, but overall, I think what he's trying to say is basically, I wouldn't say Zack Snyder. Again, I don't know if Zack Snyder is a nihilistic person or that's how he views the world. I don't know the man, so I can't tell you. But if he is, it certainly paints a much clearer picture of how he sees the world using these DC characters. But because you cannot argue that BVS, for the most part, is one of the most somber, depressing DC films you've ever seen, besides Joker. Like, it really is just a depressing take. And as much as I love Man of Steel, and I think Zack Snyder, I said this before, I think Zack Snyder loves the iconography of these characters more than he understands these characters. And I think that's why so many people are so divisive over his take on the DCEU. Do I think that he fully understands the essence of Superman? I don't. I think that he thinks he does, but when you break it down and you give a fair, constructive criticism, I don't think he fully understands Superman as a character, because Superman is so optimistic. And that's why when you look at his take on DC films and his take on Superman, you can see how his Zack Snyder's ideologies doesn't really resonate with the rest of the world, and especially with the character of Superman, who is the embodiment of hope, of love, of caring for other people. And you don't really see that, or it's not really fully explored in Zack Snyder's DCEU, and I think that's why Zack Snyder's DCEU ultimately failed with resonating with the general audience. But what do you think? It's a very, very interesting article, and it really gives you some food for thought. So hit like, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Discord, TikTok. This is Zack Shakes. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you think of this article? I thought it was well written. I thought it was a very interesting insight into the world of DCEU and into the mind of Zack Snyder. Yeah, very interesting. So love you all. Stay safe. Truth. Put the tongue right there. Out.